Hi everyone, this is Grace and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today we are going to learn how to decorate this fun Tiffany's inspired birthday set. First up, I am outlining and flooding this first cookie. I'm doing a 2 consistency outline and flood. At the time that I made these cookies, I just preferred doing 2 consistencies. I think sometimes it can be a little more predictable, and it's certainly easier to make, especially if you're just getting used to working with royal icing. The reason why it's easier to make. So when you're doing a 2 consistency outline and flood, you're using a thicker piping consistency to outline the cookie first, and then a thinner flood consistency to flood the cookie. Now, I think it's easier to make because there's a bit more leeway in how thick your outline can be and how thick or thin your flood can be. When you're doing a single consistency, you're using the same consistency to both outline and flood. And there's a much smaller window of consistency where it is just thin enough that it's going to settle flat, but it's also thick enough that it's not going to just fall off the surface of the cookie. So when I do a 2 consistency like this, I outline first and I allow that outline to dry, and then I flood. Now you can see here I used a scribe on those corners. I find that really sharp corners, I need to use a scribe to get the icing in there. Otherwise, it doesn't quite get that nice crisp corner. Right now I am piping the bow that's going on this cookie, and I'm using 1 consistency in this case. You certainly could use 2, but I just preferred at this time to use 1. And I would call this a thick flood. So it's the kind of flood that probably needs a little assistance to settle out. And I do like to do that for smaller cookies or smaller spaces like this. This is a bit too big of a space, I would say, to use, say, like a pressure piping technique with a soft peak piping consistency. So you can see here I am using my scribe to kind of help it settle, and also encouraging it to be nice and flush with the edge of the shape of the cookie. That's something great about doing 1 consistency, is that there's a little more flexibility in the outline of your shape. So just something to keep in mind. You can always use that scribe to encourage it towards the edge of the cookie, or maybe you can even adjust the shape ever so slightly. It's a really great tool to use, that scribe. I have a few different scribes myself. Some people have a ton. I think scribes are like shoes where you have a different scribe for different purposes. Some people have 1, some people have a handful, and some people have 1 for every mood. I'm the kind of person that has a handful, and I have them for very different purposes. I have 1 that's really thin, 1 that's really thick, and 1 that's plastic and just a bit different of a tip. So here I am using my projector, love my projector, to actually draw on this lettering with an edible marker. I chose to do an edible marker in this case just because I'm not the most confident with really small lettering. I tried piping this out and it wasn't clean enough for my liking, so I decided to use an edible marker. I will link an edible marker option in the description of the video. Just an FYI, if you're like me and you use lemon juice in your royal icing, I have found that some black edible markers will not stay black on my icing. They'll turn kind of green, and I assume that's from the lemon juice, the acidity in my icing, because I know that others who use vanilla and just water in their royal icing don't have the same issue. So just something to keep in mind. And that is the Tiffany's box inspired cookie. And next up, I was inspired by a string of pearls for this one. I am actually painting highlighter directly onto the surface of the cookie, and this is a pretty cool technique to do. I always mix my highlighter or dust with Everclear. It's an incredibly high proof alcohol, and what that does is that the alcohol evaporates from the mixture that you have painted on your cookie, so it dries without that liquid in it. So don't worry if you're giving these to kids, the alcohol evaporates away, and the higher the proof, the faster that alcohol evaporates. I also find when you're using metallics that it's better to use alcohol. I know some people use extracts. I personally have never done that, so I can't vouch for that. Something else to keep in mind is this is a highlighter. It is pretty commonly used in cookie and cake decorating, but if you would prefer a completely edible option, I will also link that in the description of the video. I personally used to use highlighter a lot more than I do now. I only use it in very rare instances. You just can't get the same kind of coverage and sheen that you can get with a highlighter with the edible dusts that are out there. So just keep that in mind. Highlighters are non-toxic. It just depends on the country you're in, whether they're considered by the Food and Drug Administration of that country to be edible or not. So here I am outlining and flooding with one consistency. So I am using the same exact bag. That was just a choppy editing right there. But this is the same bag, and I'm just applying significantly more pressure on my bag. Same bag, same opening, same icing consistency. And I will say that this was back in the day when I used gel food coloring to color my black. And I do not do that anymore. When you use gel food coloring, it requires way too much coloring to get it rich enough. And it is super easy to oversaturate your icing. And I can tell here, just based on how it dried, doesn't have a sheen. It looks honestly dry, and I can tell just by the look of it that I put too much food coloring in this icing, because this is what visually it's going to do to the icing. So just something to keep that in mind. Now I use highly pigmented powders to color my black and my red. Red also has a similar struggle. I'm a fan of the sugar art, so I'll link that in the description of this video. And here I am using a soft peak piping consistency to pipe these pearls out. A soft peak is great because, as you can see, as I'm piping it, it doesn't leave a peak on the little pearl. And that just makes my life a lot easier, because then I don't have to go in with a scribe and settle out every single little dot. You certainly could use a medium peak, but again, if you want that smooth surface, you would need to use a scribe to help that settle. I would imagine here I'm probably using a PME 1.5. That was my favorite tip when I was still using tips all the time. Piping tips, that is. I will also link that in the description of the video. If you are brand new to piping anything, any kind of icing, frosting, I do think tips are helpful because you can standardize it a bit more. I know today all the rage are the tipless bags, but I personally started using tips, and then I got more comfortable and transitioned to tipless bags. And here I have allowed that 16 to dry completely. And now I'm painting on with the same highlighter and same application as I did on the edge of the cookie. And it's really important that you allow your icing to dry completely before you paint on top of it. I've had some sad crater disasters when I haven't let it dry completely. And now here I am painting on some edible pearl dust, pearl sheen onto the pearls just to give it a more pearly look instead of just white. And I'll link that in the description of the video as well. It can be pretty hard to get used to the amount of product to have on the end of your brush when painting. It's really easy to have too much, and then the second you touch that brush down onto the surface, it just like pools onto the cookie, onto the flood, and you're just like, no. I still do that today. But there we go. That is the pearl cookie. And then last up is just a sweet rose. This is a Wilton 1M tip. It's a beautiful open star, or is it a closed star tip? It's a star tip of some form, but I'll link that in the description. And then I'm just using a bit of edible glitter here and some sprinkles just to finish this off. This is a really great, easy way to do a beautiful design that's pretty quick. It's nice to balance out sets with more complicated and less complicated designs, both for the visual aspect, but also just execution. So not everything takes forever. So that's the little rosette there. And that, friends, is the entire Tiffany's inspired set. I hope you enjoyed watching, and I hope you have some fun making this yourself.